They were the picture of happiness, a young couple, dressed in wedding whites, stepping into the forest for one last photo shoot before sunset. But they never came back. No sound, no struggle, no goodbye, just a vanished bride and groom, and a photographer left holding the last photo ever taken. For years, the mystery haunted a small mountain town, until one man returned to the scene, and what he captured changed everything. This isn't just a story about loss. It's about what lies beyond, just out of sight. Stay with us, because what the photographer saw next, you'll never forget. Asterisk. They said it was the most beautiful day their town had seen in years. June. Sunlight poured gently through the trees like warm honey, casting a golden glow over every rooftop and every smiling face that gathered for the wedding of Claire Bennett and Matthew Rhodes. It was the kind of afternoon that people remember, not just because of what happened, but because of how it felt like the world had paused for a breath to honor something pure and rare. The couple had been together since they were teenagers, two souls that had weathered years, loss, and distance, only to find their way back to each other like gravity pulling them home. The ceremony, held under the great oaks beside Lake Nora, in upstate New York, was quiet, sincere, and full of tears that no one was embarrassed to shed. Claire, in a lace-trimmed gown that looked almost vintage, held onto Matthew's arm like she had waited her whole life just to be in that moment. And Matthew, tall and quietly protective, couldn't take his eyes off her. After the ceremony, as guests made their way toward the reception tent, strung with fairy lights and soft jazz music, the couple slipped away with their photographer, Hank Walters, to capture a few golden hour portraits. Hank had been doing wedding photography for nearly 30 years and had an eye for moments, fleeting glances, wind-lifted veils, that one perfect kiss between laughter. He had scouted the perfect location earlier that week, a little-known overlook, tucked into the state park, with a breathtaking view of the lake and just enough wildflowers to give the edge of the forest a soft, romantic haze. Claire loved the idea. She wanted something that felt timeless, untouched. They drove out in Matthew's pickup, the three of them chatting easily. Hank remembered how the sun broke through the trees as they arrived, casting long, warm shadows. Claire was glowing, not just from the light, but from joy that seemed to rise up from her like music only she and Matthew could hear. Hank clicked away as they twirled in the field, Matthew's arms lifting her off the ground as Claire threw her head back in laughter. He remembered crouching low to get a certain angle as Claire stood at the edge of the overlook, her veil catching the breeze like a sail. That image in particular stayed with him, the way the light hit her face, the blur of white against it to you. Deep green below. Then, something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the wind, a stillness in the birdsong. Hank had paused to change his lens, just for a moment, and when he looked back up, Claire and Matthew were gone. At first, he thought they were playing a joke, maybe ducking behind the trees or stepping off to share a private moment. But the seconds ticked by, and the clearing remained still. He called out, laughter in his voice at first, then confusion, and finally worry. He circled the area, camera still in hand, calling their names louder now. No answer. The breeze rustled the grass, but there were no footsteps, no voices, not even an echo. He ran back down the trail, thinking maybe they'd gone back to the truck, but it sat there untouched. Claire's bouquet still lay on the seat, and Matthew's suit jacket was folded neatly in the back. That's when the dread began to bloom in Hank's chest like a cold flower. He returned to the overlook and searched again, pacing the area, until the sun slipped below the hills and twilight began to gather. By the time he made it back to the reception, frantic and out of breath, the celebration was already shifting into confusion. Claire's mother, Evelyn, had been looking for her daughter for nearly an hour. Matthew's brother was scanning the roads, thinking they'd had car trouble. Hank's voice cracked as he told them what had happened. the words sounding absurd even as they left his mouth. The police were called. Flashlights swept the woods. Late into the night, helicopters joined in the morning. The community, still dressed in their wedding clothes, fanned out into the forest with hope in their hearts and fear in their eyes. But no matter how many voices shouted their names, no matter how many trails were retraced, Claire and Matthew were gone. Back at home, Hank couldn't sleep. He kept scrolling through the photos he'd taken that evening, zooming in on every shadow, every blurred leaf, every faint edge. Something had to be there. Something had to explain how two people, so full of life, so deeply rooted in this world, could vanish within a breath. And then he saw a dot in the final photo, the one of Claire at the overlook. He noticed a detail he hadn't seen before. In the lower right-hand corner, near the trees, just beyond where the grass dipped into shadow, was a shape. Tall, narrow, almost human. It wasn't moving, but it also wasn't part of the landscape. Hank stared at it for a long time, chills rising across his arms. He didn't know yet what it was or what it meant. But something about that photo made the hairs on his neck stand on end, because whatever that shape was, it hadn't been there when he took the shot. By dawn, the entire town of Fairwood had awakened into a different reality, one that felt hollow and wrong, like a song ending on the wrong note. The joy from Claire and Matthew's wedding, so vivid and tangible just the day before, had drained. Away overnight, leaving behind a stillness so heavy it pressed on people's chests. There had been no sign of them, no phone call, no footsteps on gravel, not even the sound of breaking branches in the underbrush. It was as if the forest had opened up and swallowed them whole. Word spread fast, not just because the town was small, but because Claire and Matthew were beloved. Everyone had watched them grow up, Claire with her quiet kindness, always the first to help, and Matthew with that steady calm that people instinctively trusted. They were the kind of couple you rooted for, the kind that made people believe in lasting love. That they could simply vanish on their wedding day was unthinkable. Police arrived within the hour, setting up a makeshift base near the edge of the forest trail where Hank had last seen them. The sheriff, a graying man named Don Halley, who'd known both families for decades, took personal command of the search. He didn't bother with bureaucracy. He knew what needed to be done. Search and rescue teams were called in from nearby counties. Tracking dogs were brought in. Drones buzzed above the trees, scanning the forest canopy, while volunteers combed through the thickets in carefully organized lines, calling out until their voices turned hoarse. The entire town came out to help. Some wore their wedding clothes still stained with wine and grass, refusing to change until Claire and Matthew were found. Others brought food and supplies to the search crews. No one asked to be thanked. It was a collective ache they all shared. Evelyn Bennett, Claire's mother, refused to go home. She sat on a camp chair just outside the police line, her daughter's childhood quilt draped over her shoulders even in the June heat, her hands clenched in prayer that never ended. Matthew's father, Robert, paced like a man caught in a current. He couldn't escape, demanding more helicopters, more dogs, more eyes. He was convinced it had to be foul play, that someone had taken them. Why else would they vanish without a sound? His certainty became a kind of anchor for others, something to hold on to amidst the growing chaos. But as the hours passed and no ransom call came, no trail was found, no screams echoed from the trees, fear began to take on a different shape. It wasn't just about danger anymore. It was about something that didn't make sense. And at the center of it all was Hank Walters, the photographer who had taken the last known photo of the couple. He had told the police everything, how they were smiling one moment and gone the next, how he had turned away for just a second to change a lens, how there had been no sound, no movement, no warning. He showed them the photo, the one with Claire's veil fluttering like a ghost above the cliffside, and he pointed out the shape in the background, the one he hadn't noticed until the night before. The officers looked at it, squinted, nodded. Maybe it was a tree, maybe it wasn't. They said it was inconclusive, probably a trick of the light. Hank didn't push back at first. He was still too stunned, too unsure of his own eyes. But inside, he was unraveling. He replayed every step of that shoot in his head like a looped film reel. He questioned whether he had heard something and dismissed it, whether there had been a change in the air, a shift in temperature, a silence that meant more than he realized. He began to doubt his own memory. He had taken thousands of photos over the years, dozens of couples standing in that golden light, laughing and kissing and walking away hand in hand. But never like this. Never a shoot that ended in silence. Never a session where the couple didn't come back. The town began to speculate, quietly at first, and then more openly. Some blamed wild animals, despite the lack of blood or torn clothing. Others whispered about old mines, sinkholes, hidden caves. A few, mostly older folks who remembered things others had forgotten, started to murmur about the forest itself. They said there were parts of it you didn't go into after dark, paths that disappeared when you tried to follow them. They said Claire and Matthew weren't the first to vanish out there, though no one could recall names or dates. Just feelings. Just rumors. Reporters showed up by the second day, their vans and equipment disrupting the rhythm of the search. They asked pointed questions and snapped photos of grieving family members. Sheriff Halley did his best to shield the town, but once the national networks picked up the story, newlyweds vanished without a trace. After Photoshoot, it was out of his hands. The story had become bigger than Fairwood, bigger than any. One explanation: Claire and Matthew had become symbols, and that only deepened the ache of those who knew them as flesh and blood. Hank stopped sleeping altogether. He sat in front of his computer late into the night, zooming in on every photo from that day. Not just the final image, but all of them. He examined the tree lines, the shadows, the reflections in Matthew's eyes. He began to see things that didn't belong: blurred lines where there should be sharp ones, double exposures he hadn't created, faint distortions in the leaves, and always, in that last photo, that strange, still figure. The more he looked at it, the more certain he became that it wasn't just a shape. It was watching them. It had been there, quiet and unnoticed, as if waiting for something. And yet, as each day passed with no answers, what frightened Hank most wasn't the possibility that something sinister had taken Claire and Matthew. What frightened him was the idea that maybe they had chosen to go. That whatever had beckoned them from the edge of that overlook had offered something irresistible, something beautiful enough, or strange enough, or familiar enough to make them take that final step without hesitation. And if that were true, what could possibly call someone away from the people they loved most on the happiest day of their lives? In the days that followed, Hank Walters became a man unmoored. While the rest of Fairwood tried to return to their routines, albeit under the heavy cloud of grief and mystery, he drifted further from his old self, caught in a loop of guilt, fear, and a deepening sense of something just out of reach. He had taken hundreds of wedding photos over the course of his career, but none had ever ended like this. None had lodged in his soul like a thorn he couldn't pull out. His wife, Margaret, watched him with growing concern as he sat hunched over his laptop for hours each night, sifting through pixels with a desperation that bordered on madness. She tried to speak to him gently, tried to place a warm hand on his shoulder, reminding him that this wasn't his fault, that he had done all he could, but her words didn't reach him. He was chasing something he couldn't quite name, something he felt pulsing beneath the surface of every image he had taken that day. The forest had taken them. That phrase repeated itself in his mind again and again, not as a conclusion, but as a question wrapped in shadow. It was easy to blame the woods. It was vast, wild, and indifferent. But Hank didn't believe in easy explanations, not after what he'd seen. Every time he looked at that last photograph, the strange figure near the trees seemed to take on new dimensions. Sometimes it looked like a person. Other times, it appeared more like a silhouette in motion, a smear in the fabric of the image, as if time itself had stuttered there. He adjusted the brightness, zoomed in with careful fingers, toggled contrast, sharpened edges, every trick he'd learned over decades behind the lens. But the more he tried to clarify the image, the more it resisted him, like it was alive. In some quiet, malicious way, he began revisiting the site of the photo shoot. Every morning, before the sun was fully up, he would lace his boots, sling his camera bag over one shoulder, and hike the now infamous trail alone. The police tape was long gone, but a sense of trespass clung to the path. The trees whispered. Overhead, the underbrush rustled with unseen movement, and the light never seemed to fall the same way twice. Hank would stand at the overlook for hours, scanning the horizon, stepping through the grass where Claire had stood, kneeling where Matthew had knelt to kiss her hand. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Maybe a dropped earring, a torn scrap of cloth, a flash of movement between the trees. But the forest gave him nothing. Not sound, not sign, not peace. Margaret pleaded with him to stop. She told him it wasn't healthy, that it wasn't right to carry the weight of something he couldn't fix. He nodded and promised he'd ease up. But every morning he returned to the woods more determined than before. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It had become something deeper, a need to understand. And underneath that, something darker. The suspicion that whatever had happened to Claire and Matthew wasn't finished. That it might still be happening, even now, just beyond his reach. Then came the dreams. At first they were scattered, shapeless, a flicker of white in a forest clearing, the echo of laughter dissolving into wind. But soon they became clearer and more persistent. He saw Claire walking barefoot along the path, her dress stained with earth, her veil dragging behind her like a tether. She didn't speak, but she looked at him with eyes wide and pleading. Matthew would appear beside her sometimes, his arm protectively around her, but always with the same expression, not fear, not anger, but confusion, as if they were caught in a place they couldn't quite name. Hank would wake up gasping, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, the images lingering behind his eyelids long after the sun rose. One evening, while rechecking an early frame from the shoot, the one where Claire was adjusting her veil, just before they posed together, Hank noticed something else. It wasn't the shadowy figure this time. It was a ripple, barely perceptible, along the edge of the photo near the treetops. A distortion, not like a lens flare or a motion blur, but something that looked like a curtain being pulled aside in the air itself. He stared at it for a long time, then printed the photo in high resolution and pinned it to the wall of his office. That ripple felt important, though he couldn't explain why. It was as if the forest had folded in that moment, bent inward, like it had made room for something or someone. He started speaking less, barely eating, sleeping only when exhaustion forced him to. Margaret grew afraid. One night, she found him standing in the backyard, camera in hand, staring into the woods that bordered their property. When she asked what he was doing, he turned slowly and said, "They're still out there. I can feel them." His voice was calm, almost reverent, like someone in church. Word began to spread. People in town noticed how different Hank had become gaunt. Distracted, his once dependable stride now slow and searching. Friends stopped calling. Clients quietly canceled bookings. And yet, he didn't care. All that mattered now was finding the pattern. Because a small, relentless part of him had begun to wonder. What if the camera hadn't just captured a moment of their disappearance, but the very mechanism of it? What if the lens, in its attempt to frame beauty, had brushed up against something ancient and invisible, something that had chosen to show itself only once? And if that were true, what might it want to reveal next? The morning light was soft when Hank pulled open the curtains to his study, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the edge of the fabric. The photograph pinned above his desk had been there for over a week now, and yet every morning it looked different, as if the paper itself were shifting subtly overnight. He leaned in close, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, and stared again at the image Claire at the overlook, her veil caught in the wind, her smile unguarded, radiant. But what anchored his attention now wasn't Claire or even the Erie, a ripple near the treetops. It was what had emerged near her shoulder, a face, half hidden in the shadows of the forest, barely visible unless one knew where to look. It wasn't clear, but it had the unmistakable shape of eyes and a mouth, not smiling, not moving, just watching. He hadn't seen it before. Somehow it had escaped him through dozens of passes, thousands of zooms and filters. But now that he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The face was there, and it hadn't belonged to anyone present that day. It wasn't a guest, nor a park ranger, nor anyone from town. Hank would have remembered. This face was wrong in a quiet, precise way, the proportions slightly off, the gaze too direct, too knowing. He felt a chill creep up his back as he stepped away from the desk and sat down, breathing heavily. It didn't feel like a camera glitch or digital noise. It felt a deliberate dot with hands that had steadied 1,000 camera shots but now quivered. With unease, he saved the image onto a flash drive and drove an hour south to visit an old colleague, Jack Ferris, a retired forensic analyst who had worked crime scenes back in his prime. They hadn't spoken in years, but Jack welcomed him in with the curiosity of a man who missed mystery more than he'd like to admit. Hank handed him the drive, explained little, and waited while Jack loaded the photo onto his high-resolution monitor. The older man leaned forward, his brows tightening almost immediately. They sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes before Jack said, "You didn't edit this?" Hank shook his head. "Not a pixel. That's straight from the original card." Jack nodded slowly, then pointed toward the shadow in the background, outlining the figure with a trembling cursor. "You see this here? That's not motion blur. That's layering." As if the subject wasn't entirely within the same focal depth as the rest of the image. Like it didn't belong in the same moment. He paused. "I've only seen anomalies like this in manipulated composites, but your metadata checks out. This photo wasn't altered, which means whatever this is, it was actually there." The words sank into Hank like stones into deep water. He leaned back, his stomach tightening. "What do you think it is?" he asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up color filters, enhancing low contrast areas, revealing another distortion near Claire's left hand, something that looked like a fingertip reaching toward her veil. Just one. Pale, almost translucent. Jack said nothing more, but Hank could see it in his expression. This was beyond the realm of photo editing or camera malfunction. This was something else. Something neither of them could name. On the drive home, Hank gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, his thoughts racing. The face, the hand, the unnatural layering, what did it mean? Could someone have been there hiding just beyond the tree line, moving in a way that defied natural motion? Or was it not someone at all, but something? The forest had always held a kind of hush, a reverence you could feel in your bones. But now it felt like it had secrets that went deeper than time. That night, he didn't sleep. He reviewed every other photo from the shoot, each frame becoming a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving. In one image, Matthew stood with his back to the woods, laughing with Claire, and in the upper left corner, Hank spotted another oddity, a ripple again, like a fold in the air, almost a shape of a doorway, but only half-formed. He began charting the angles of light, the progression of shadows, the shifting lines in the background. It was as though something had been circling them during that shoot, inching closer frame by frame. Something that remained just out of direct focus, but not entirely invisible to the lens. Then he thought of something else. Years ago, during a wedding in the Catskills, he'd taken a photo where a guest's reflection appeared in a window, but not in the position they had been standing. At the time, he'd brushed it off as a lens quirk. But now he wondered, what if cameras occasionally picked up not just what was there, but what lingered beneath? What if they could capture glimpses of things not meant for the eye, but present? All the same, unable to hold it in any longer, Hank called Sheriff Halley the next morning and asked to speak to him privately. He brought his laptop, the printouts, everything. Halley, a practical man hardened by years of human tragedy, listened politely but visibly tensed as Hank spoke. When shown the images, he leaned forward, lips tight, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "It's strange," he admitted. "But it's not proof of anything." Hank felt the door close with that sentence, a quiet click of dismissal. "People see what they want to see in grief," the sheriff added, not unkindly. "Maybe you're looking for ghosts, Hank, because the truth that we may never know what happened is too unbearable." But Hank didn't believe that. He couldn't, because something had reached into that frame. Something had been near Claire in that final moment. And he knew it hadn't been grief playing tricks. It had been presence. Real, chilling presence. Something not of their world, but adjacent to it. And he had caught it in the act of reaching through. The camera, for all its simplicity, had told the truth in ways no one else would. And Hank, once a man who captured smiles in sunlight, now found himself documenting the unexplained, caught in a silent battle with something that had no name, no face, except, now, in a single frame of film. The forest had a way of quieting everything else. Hank noticed it as soon as his boots crossed the edge of the trailhead once more. The same path he had walked dozens of times since Claire and Matthew vanished. But today, it felt different. Not just in the air, which hung heavier than usual, damp and close, but in the silence itself, a kind of hush that didn't come from absence, but from restraint. The trees seemed to hold their breath, as though watching him. He didn't tell Margaret. He was coming out again. She had stopped asking questions 3 days ago and had begun to sleep with her back turned to him. He understood her exhaustion, her grief, though they wore different masks. But the questions were louder now than her pleas, and he could no longer ignore the pull that kept drawing him back. He wasn't sure what he expected to find this time, but something in the photographs had lingered in his mind all week. The distorted edge near the cliff, the faint lines that didn't match the natural angles of the land. He had traced them again and again, overlaying the map from the Parks Department, matching tree lines, counting steps from the overlook to the ridge. That's when he realized something. The path he and the couple had followed on the day of the shoot didn't quite match the marked trails on any official record. Curious and unsettled, he brought an old topographic map from the 1960s, a crinkled relic he found buried in the town's historical archives, hoping for a comparison. And there it was, a faint dotted line, leading away from the cliffside, winding deeper into the woods toward a part of the park, now marked as restricted due to unstable ground and fallen rock. The modern maps no longer showed it. No trail signs pointed that way. But once, clearly, it had been known a trail maintained, walked, mapped, now erased. Forgotten. It was still early morning as Hank stepped past the overlook and into the underbrush where no path was supposed to be. He pushed aside ferns and ducked under low branches, each step guided more by instinct than sight. The ground was soft, damp with old leaf litter, and the deeper he walked, The more he noticed how the forest seemed to fold around him, less like he was entering, and more like something was closing behind. There were no sounds except the subtle crunch of his boots and the rhythmic pulse of his breath. After a half hour, he found it, the remnants of an old wooden post, barely visible beneath a blanket of moss and ivy. He knelt beside it, brushing it clean with his sleeve, revealing a rusted nail and a scrap of painted wood-faded green, like an ancient marker once nailed bare. Hank felt his heart quicken. He pressed onward, following what little remained of the forgotten trail. The sun was climbing now, shafts of light filtering through the high canopy and slanted golden beams, illuminating floating specks of dust and pollen that gave the space an almost sacred glow. Then, suddenly, the trees opened into a small clearing, and there it stood, a cabin, nearly consumed by the forest, its roof sagging under the weight of years and rot, walls cloaked in moss, windows dark as river stones. Hank froze. There had been no mention of this place in any map, not even the oldest one. It looked untouched for decades. He stepped closer, cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the strap of his camera as though it might offer some form of protection. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a single large room filled with dust, cobwebs, and remnants of a life long extinguished. A rusted wood stove stood crooked in one corner, and above it, a shelf held a few broken plates and a mason jar full of murky liquid. The table in the center of the room still held a deck of cards mid-game, like whoever had been here had simply walked out one day and never returned. But it was the far wall that held him in place. Carved into the wood, dozens, maybe hundreds of markings, initials, dates, and names. Some were barely visible, scrawled so faintly they looked like they'd been written in haste. But one stood out, freshly etched near the bottom in unmistakable loops. Claire, June 2010. Hank's breath caught. His hands trembled. He reached out and ran his fingers over the carving, as if touch could make it more real. It was her name. It was the date of the wedding. But how? Who had done this? And when? The dust in the room said no one had entered. In years, that this carving was clear, clean, and untouched by time. Beneath her name, faintly and jagged, another inscription. Still here. Hank stumbled back, his heart pounding in his throat. He looked around wildly, expecting movement, sound, some clue that this was a trick or a message meant to frighten. But there was only silence. He raised his camera and took a photo of the wall, hands still shaking, the familiar click of the shutter echoing unnaturally loud. Then he noticed something in the lower corner of the room, a photograph, old and yellowed, half buried under a broken chair leg. He pulled it free and turned it over. It was a black and white picture of another couple, dressed in wedding clothes, standing at the very same overlook where Claire and Matthew had posed. The groom wore a narrow tie, the bride a modest dress with lace sleeves. On the back, someone had written in neat cursive, Eliza and Thomas Dempsey, minus 1,949. Hank stood frozen. The name sounded faintly familiar, a story once half heard. Long forgotten dot, as he left the cabin, the wind picked up slightly, stirring the tall grass. Something about the air had changed again. Not dangerous, exactly, but not safe. As he followed the broken trail back toward the modern world, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't found something. Something had let itself be found. And whatever had drawn him here today had done so with purpose. Because someone or something wanted the story to continue. Back in Fairwood, the name Thomas Dempsey burned in Hank's mind like a brand he couldn't escape. As soon as he returned home, dusty and pale, he headed straight to the den, spreading the photo of the bride and groom from 1949 across his desk. The moment he saw the overlook in the background, that same rocky ridge bathed in quiet light, he knew it wasn't coincidence. This couple had been there before Claire and Matthew, same place, same pose, same disappearing trail. He stared at their frozen smiles, at the formality in their posture, and felt something stirring, an unease that reached down into history. He needed answers. So he drove to the Fairwood Historical Society, a squat red brick building with ivy creeping over its windows and a brass bell on the door that chimed with old dignity. Inside, the scent of aged paper and oiled wood wrapped around him like memory itself. He found her behind the counter, Miss Corinne Latham, the town historian, 84 years old, sharp as glass and just as clear. She had lived through the stories most people only read about. When Hank placed a photograph on the counter and asked about Thomas and Eliza Dempsey, she stared at it for a long time before nodding slowly. "I remember them," she said. "Eliza was a local girl. Thomas moved up here from Syracuse. They married in the summer of '49, but—" She paused, her mouth tightening. They were only married a few hours. Vanished that same evening. Folks searched for weeks. Never found them. It shook this town something fierce. Hank felt the floor tilt beneath him. "At the Overlook?" he asked, though he already knew. She nodded again, this time slower. "Yes, they went up there for wedding pictures, just like the others." That word "others" hung in the air between them, heavy and trembling. "Wait," he said carefully. "You mean Claire and Matthew, and who else?" Miss Latham's eyes searched his face before. She turned and reached beneath the counter. She returned with a faded manila folder, labeled in pencil, "Vanishing Brides." Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and at least 3 more black and white photographs, each featuring different couples, always a bride in a gown, a groom in a suit, always smiling, always standing at that same cliff's edge. The earliest dated back to 1922, Sarah and David Connolly. Then 1936, then 49. Each disappearance happened on a wedding day. Each couple went missing after posing for photos at the Ridge. Each time no bodies were found, no evidence, no reason, just gone. Hank's skin prickled as he ran his fingers through the past. "Why hasn't anyone said anything?" he asked, incredulous. Why wasn't this common knowledge? Corinne's voice was quieter now, because people stopped wanting to remember. You lose enough good people, and it becomes easier to pretend it didn't happen. Easier to close the trail and let the woods take back what it wants. Besides, the stories started sounding too strange. Folks said the place was cursed, that something lived in the trees. Most thought it was nonsense, so the town buried it. And the trail, too. Hank left the Historical Society with the folder pressed to his chest, the weight of nearly a century of silence bearing down on his shoulders. Back home, he laid out the evidence on his floor: photographs, newspaper clippings, maps old and new, names and dates, faces and smiles and lace veils fluttering in frozen time. The pattern was clear now. The disappearances had rhythm, an echo that repeated every decade or so, always targeting couples, always around the summer solstice, always from that same overlook. The symmetry was uncanny and terrifying. The most chilling discovery, though, came later that night when he compared the photos, carefully aligning the angles, scaling the distances, matching the backdrop of trees and rocks. It was there in every frame. The same crooked tree branch arching over the bride's shoulder. The same ridge stone with the flat top like a table. And behind it, just barely, always a blur. A shape, a figure. Sometimes it looked like a shadow behind a tree. Other times a face in the leaves, and in one terrifying image, the hem of a dress that didn't belong to the bride. Something or someone had been watching every single time. And now, with Claire and Matthew, it had stepped closer than ever before. He showed the photographs to Margaret, hoping for confirmation or clarity, or even just a shared chill. But she recoiled. "Stop this, Hank," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, This isn't healthy. You're spiraling." When he tried to explain that the disappearances weren't random, that there was a pattern, a force, a thread connecting them all, she turned away. "There's nothing left to find," she whispered. "And if there is, maybe we're not supposed to." But Hank couldn't stop, not now. The more he uncovered, the more he felt like he was part of the story, not just recording it. Like whatever had taken those couples wasn't just acting. It was repeating, waiting, calling. He remembered what he had read in one of the old police reports. No signs of a struggle. No footprints. No blood. Just gone. But now he suspected it wasn't violence that had taken them. It was something else entirely. Something seductive. Something ancient. Something that lured them in gently, without force. Like a voice in the trees that sounded like someone you loved. He stayed up through the night cataloging everything. And as the first light of morning touched the corner of his study, casting long shadows over the photographs on the floor, Hank realized something terrible and clear. The pattern was cyclical, predictable, every decade or so. And Claire and Matthew had vanished in 2010. It was 2020. Now, the cycle had started again. It was just past 5 in the morning when Hank zipped his jacket, slung his camera bag over one shoulder, and stepped quietly out the front door without waking Margaret. The sky was a pale gray, not yet light, not quite dark, and the town of Fairwood lay still, caught in that breathless hush before daybreak. He didn't need to check his notes again. The date was burned into his mind, June 21st, the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the day every couple in those faded photographs had vanished. The cycle, he was certain now, was more than just coincidence. It was a pattern, and patterns had meaning, purpose. He didn't know what had happened to Claire and Matthew 10 years ago, but he believed now deeply, with a trembling kind of clarity, that whatever force had taken them might reveal itself again if he was brave. Enough to return to the ridge and wait. The forest greeted him with silence. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing as he crossed the now overgrown path, stepping lightly through the thickening underbrush, following a route that by now he could walk with his eyes closed. The trail had nearly disappeared, reclaimed by the wild over the years, but he saw it still in the subtle curve of the trees, in the way the light shifted at certain bends, in the quiet pull that seemed to draw him forward. He walked without hurry, letting the forest swallow him, letting his thoughts settle into the rhythm of the wind and leaves and breath. When he reached the overlook, he stopped. The ridge stretched out before him, just as it always had, stone beneath his feet, trees falling away below, the horizon yawning wide beyond the mountains. But the light was different now. Not brighter, not darker, just changed. It had a softness to it, like it was bending around something unseen. He set his camera down slowly, adjusting the tripod, framing the shot just as he had 10 years ago. He didn't take any photos yet. He just stood there, waiting, listening. That hours passed. The sun climbed, the shadows shifted, but nothing moved, except the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Still, Hank didn't leave. He sat on a nearby rock, watching, remembering every detail of that last shoot. Claire's laugh, Matthew's quiet grin, the way they'd looked at each other. He imagined their final steps, imagined the moment they vanished, what they might have seen or heard just before. He tried to put himself there, in their minds, in their bodies. What had drawn them toward the trees? Was it sound? Light? A memory? A feeling? Then, around noon, something changed. It wasn't sudden. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over the ground. The air grew still, unnaturally still, and the warmth of the sun dulled, as if filtered through thick glass. The forest quieted, and a strange hush fell across the ridge. Hank stood up. A flicker of motion at the edge of his vision caught his attention. He turned, expecting a deer or bird, but there was nothing. And yet, he felt it. Presence. Something watching. Something just beyond the veil of ordinary sight. He reached for his camera, adjusted the lens, and began taking slow, deliberate photographs. One every 30 seconds. Click. Wait. Click. Wait. The ridge remained empty. And yet his heart pounded. He stepped forward carefully, scanning the tree line. Then he saw it. Not a person, not quite, but a shape, a shimmer. Like heat rising from pavement, but vertical and faintly humming with movement. It was near the same spot where Claire had stood. He took another photo, but even as the shutter clicked, the shape seemed to fade, as though sensing the capture. He moved toward it, cautiously, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The space around him felt thinner, like reality itself had softened, and the next step might take him not just across distance, but across something deeper. He stood at the spot and closed his eyes, and then he heard it. Not words, not exactly. More like a melody, low, sad, and old. A tune that stirred something in him, a memory that didn't feel like his own. Images flashed in his mind. Claire turning her head, Matthew reaching out, the trees parting before them like curtains. And that sense again, not danger, but invitation. As if the forest was offering something, asking him to understand. He opened his eyes. The shimmer was gone. But where it had been, the ground looked disturbed. Not freshly dug, not marked, but somehow different. He knelt and touched the earth. It was cold. He stood and began walking again, deeper into the trees, beyond where he had ever dared before. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last, and the forest grew darker, though the sun was still high. He passed the place where the old cabin had stood, now nothing but collapsed timber and moss, and pushed on, guided only by instinct. Eventually, he came upon a glade he didn't recognize, though he had been through this forest 100 times. It was small, encircled by stones, and filled with wildflowers that didn't grow anywhere else. In the center stood a single tree, taller than the rest, its bark pale and smooth, almost silver. Hanging from its lowest branch was something that made him freeze. A veil, white, delicate, fluttering in the breeze. Hank stepped forward and reached for it. But the moment his fingers brushed the fabric, a sound rushed through the trees like breath, startling, intimate, close, a whisper. A name, Claire. And then, for just a moment, the air before him shimmered again, and he saw them. Standing together, Claire and Matthew. Not lost, not harmed, but changed. Older, somehow, yet untouched. They looked at him with deep, knowing eyes, not sad, not joyous, but full of something beyond either. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they were gone. He stumbled back, breath caught in his throat, heart hammering. He didn't know if what he had seen was real, but he knew this. They weren't dead. Not in the way the world believed. They had stepped into something else. Answered. A call no one else could hear. And maybe, just maybe, they were still waiting for someone to follow. Hank didn't speak of what he saw. Not to Margaret, not to the sheriff, not even to the cracked mirror in his study, where he sometimes paused now and again, trying to decide if he still recognized the man staring back. Something in him had shifted. Since the moment he touched the veil and saw Claire and Matthew standing just beyond the reach of everything known. It hadn't been imagination. It couldn't have been. The colors, the clarity, the way the air itself had felt different, as if time had stretched thin like worn fabric and let something bleed through it, all carried a weight no dream ever could. In the days that followed, he moved through Fairwood like a ghost, doing just enough to keep suspicion low. He went to the grocery store, exchanged pleasantries with neighbors, nodded to passing cars. But inside, he lived somewhere else now. halfway between the world everyone else knew and that moment in the clearing where something ancient had cracked open before him. The photograph he took that day haunted him most. When he got home, hands still trembling, he uploaded the pictures from his camera, half expecting the images to be blank, washed out, or corrupted. But they were there, frame after frame of trees and stone and shifting light. And in 3 of them, the shimmer was visible, faint but unmistakable. In one, you could see the exact spot where Claire and Matthew had appeared, the lines of their figures ghostly but discernible if you knew what to look for. He printed it, enlarged it, stared at it for hours. And as he did, he began to notice more. In the edges of the frame, other shapes, less defined but present. Faces, hints of silhouettes. Not just 1 or 2, but many. It was as if that place wasn't just a doorway, but a threshold, a point where the veil between worlds thinned and allowed what lay beyond to press gently, insistently, into view. And perhaps it wasn't just the missing couples he was seeing. Perhaps it was others too, those lost not to violence or time, but to something that moved beneath the world like a deep current, silent and unstoppable. He felt, more than understood, that the forest wasn't just taking people. It was keeping them, holding them in some place adjacent to the life they had left. A pocket of time, a fold in space. Something neither life nor death, but memory, maybe. Or dream. Obsessed now, Hank began piecing together the timelines again. He mapped the dates of each disappearance, marked the locations on his old surveyor's chart, overlaid the lunar calendar, solstice cycles, meteor showers, even local folklore. He spoke with old-timers at the cafes under the guise of curiosity, asking if they remembered anything strange odd weather, strange lights, odd sounds in the woods in years past. Some laughed him off, others grew quiet. One woman, Eleanor Hicks, leaned across the table and whispered that her mother used to speak of thin days, times of year when the forest breathed differently, when shadows walked a little longer, and you were told to stay close to home. Margaret grew more distant. She didn't ask anymore when he slipped out at dawn or returned just before midnight. The house was quieter now, the silence between them growing like ivy over old stone. He knew she was afraid, not just for him, but of him, of what he was becoming. But he couldn't stop, not when the veil was this thin, not when something on the other side seemed to be waiting for him. One night, unable to sleep, he stepped out onto the porch. The stars were sharp and clear overhead, the moon full and silver. The forest loomed beyond the yard, tall and watchful. He thought of Claire's veil, still folded carefully on the table in his study, and the way it had moved without wind. He thought of the way Matthew had looked at him, not pleading, not afraid, but purposeful, as if his reappearance had been a message, a summons. Hank didn't believe in ghosts, not in the way people used the word, but he believed in presence now. He believed that time was not a straight line, but a spiral, and that certain places like the ridge were points where the spiral touched itself, where moments folded together and the past breathed into the present. The next morning, he returned, not to the overlook, but to the hidden glade with the silver-barked tree. The flowers were still blooming wildly, unnaturally untouched. The veil was gone. In its place, at the base of the tree, was a small wooden box weathered but intact, its hinges rusted and delicate. He knelt and opened it with care. Inside, wrapped in linen, was a single photograph, black and white, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Hank, taken from behind, standing in the exact spot he knelt in now. The date scrawled in pencil on the back was that same day, June 21st, this year. This morning, his breath caught. The world tilted slightly, and for a moment, everything went very still. Then came a breeze soft, fragrant with pine and something older. And in that breeze, again, a whisper. Not a name this time. A sentence. "It's not over." He stood slowly, heart pounding, and looked around the clearing. Nothing stirred, but the message was clear. The forest had not finished what it started, and somehow he had become part of its story. Whether he chose to or not, back home, he pinned the new photo to his wall. Beneath it, he wrote just one word: threshold. Then he sat in silence, listening to the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, and waited for the next sign. The town of Fairwood had always worn its silence like an old coat, comfortable, broken in, and full of secrets tucked into forgotten pockets. For years, the disappearances had become little more than murmurs beneath louder conversations, whispered. Mornings passed like heirlooms from grandmother to mother to child, softened by time and reshaped into legend. But now, the silence was beginning to thin. It started with the photograph Hank pinned in the front window of the old camera shop, the one of himself, taken impossibly from behind, in a clearing no one had spoken of in 50 years. He didn't add a caption. He didn't need to. By the end of the week, nearly a dozen people had come in asking questions they hadn't dared ask before. Questions about the trail, the ridge, the couples whose names had long since faded from newspaper archives and gravestones that were never carved. First came Marla Jennings, whose Aunt Eliza had vanished in 1949, newlywed and glowing. Then Peter Connolly, grandson of Sarah and David, missing since the summer of 1922. One by one, they trickled in, not to accuse, not to demand, but to remember. And as they remembered, stories began to surface. Old ones, fragments, glimpses that had never quite made it into public record. Marla recalled a box of letters her mother once burned in the backyard without explanation. Peter spoke of a painting that had hung in his grandfather's den, always turned to face the wall after sunset. Another woman, June Barrett, confessed to dreams she'd had for years of brides walking backward into trees, veils dissolving in sunlight, voices calling her name from inside mirrors. Hank listened to them all. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. He simply gathered the stories like loose stones, building a path backward through the fog of time. The sheriff, Allie, came by one afternoon, uneasy and stiff, and lingered in the doorway of the shop like he wasn't sure if he should come in at all. When he finally stepped inside, his voice was low, eyes cautious. "You're stirring up things that don't like to be stirred," he said. "There's a reason folks let those stories go quiet." But Hank, who had seen with his own eyes what the town had chosen to forget, didn't flinch. "Maybe quiet is what allowed it to keep happening," he said. Hallie didn't argue. He just sighed, long and low, and said he'd be back if anything real turned up. But they both knew something real already had. Word spread slowly, the way truth often does in small towns. Children began asking questions at dinner tables, pointing at old photos and asking who that bride was, why her name was never spoken aloud. Churches mentioned those who had vanished in Sunday prayers. A few teenagers tried to sneak into the woods at night, but always came back before reaching the ridge, frightened not by what they saw, but by what they didn't. The forest had taken on new weight now, a kind of reverence. People stopped calling it just woods. They started calling it the place Dot at the hardware store. One of the older clerks pulled Hank aside and said he remembered hearing his father talk about a sound like wind under water that used to come from the trees in the weeks before the solstice. At the post office, a woman swore she'd once seen a veil flutter across the pavement on a still day and followed it, only to find herself at the trailhead with no memory of walking there. Hank wrote it all down. He filled notebooks with testimonies, sketches, diagrams of the glade, timelines of every reported disappearance and strange event. But more than that, he watched the town itself begin to change, not in loud ways, in glances, in the way people paused longer near the edge of the woods, in the way they began to speak to each other not with fear, but with care. One afternoon, Ms. Kareem Latham arrived at the shop again, this time holding a weathered leather-bound journal. She set it on the counter with a softness that suggested reverence. "My grandfather kept this," she said. "I wasn't sure I should bring it, but if you're going to keep looking, you might as well have all the pieces." The journal belonged to Milton Latham, a park ranger in the 1910s. His entries were meticulous, describing weather patterns, trail conditions, wildlife sightings. But scattered between the mundane were chilling notations, entries about people walking into the woods and never walking out, of songs heard on windless days, of strange footprints that led in circles before vanishing. And then one line, dated June 22nd, 1911, "Saw them again today. The two by the water. They never speak, only watch." It was the earliest record Hank had found that mentioned them, and it confirmed what he had suspected. This presence wasn't new. It had always been here, watching, waiting, choosing, whether it was something ancient or a rift in time or a force beyond comprehension. Hank no longer needed to define it. What mattered was that it had taken people, it had kept them, and it had left a trail of broken hearts and unanswered questions stretching back generations. But now, for the first time, the town wasn't looking away. It was remembering. And in the act of remembering, perhaps reclaiming something it had lost long ago. Hank believed that was part of it too, that silence fed the thing, kept it alive. But stories, when shared, had power. They were light in dark places. And Fairwood, after a century of hush, was finally beginning to speak again. By the time the first leaves began to yellow and curl at their edges, when the golden light of late summer cast long shadows through the trees and the cicadas quieted just a little earlier each evening, Hank knew it was time. Not because he was finished piecing the past together. He wasn't, and he never would be, but because the forest had started calling to him again, not with whispers or shimmered apparitions, but with silence. A different kind of silence. It was a stillness that vibrated just beneath the surface of the wind and birdsong, a stillness that suggested waiting. He had spent months listening to others, collecting stories, old notes, warnings disguised as dreams. But now the question, pressing on his chest each night as he lay awake, was no longer why it had happened, but where. Where did they go? Claire and Matthew, the Connollys. Eliza and Thomas, all of them, not dead, not buried, but elsewhere. And Hank knew, with the certainty of someone who had stared through the veil and returned, that he couldn't stay behind anymore. He packed only what he needed. His old Nikon, a journal, the photograph of Claire and Matthew he had taken from the glade, and the weathered leather journal from Milton Latham. He didn't leave a note for Margaret. Not because he didn't love her, but because he couldn't bear to say goodbye with words that might never be enough. Instead, he placed the photograph they had taken together on their 50th anniversary beside her teacup, the one where they stood smiling outside their cabin by the lake, still young, still full of plans, still untouched by the terrible weight of the unexplained. It would tell her enough Dottie left before dawn, before the sun could cast doubt on what he meant to do. The air was damp, the kind of damp that carried memory in every drop, and the path to the ridge seemed less like a walk and more like a slow descent into something deeper than forest. He didn't hesitate. His steps were sure. The way was clear. By midday, he stood again at the clearing, the silver-barked tree rising like a sentinel at its heart. The wildflowers were beginning to wilt now, their petals curling inward, folding like small, fragile hands. And at the base of the tree, right where the veil had once hung, something new had appeared. A narrow doorway, arched and formed entirely from vines and branches, had grown from the forest itself. It hadn't been there before. Not in that shape. Not in that way. He didn't question whether it was real. He didn't need to. The air beyond it shimmered faintly, just like it had that first time, and he could see, just for a heartbeat, the shapes of people standing within. They didn't wave, they didn't speak, but they waited. And he understood. This wasn't a place one found by accident. It opened only to those ready to enter. The others, Claire and Matthew, Eliza, David, all the ones who had vanished, they hadn't been taken. They had chosen to follow the pull, to step through whatever this doorway was. And now, so would he dot as he stepped closer. The forest seemed to inhale. The wind paused, and the light around him bent, folding gently across his shoulders like a cloak. He reached out, touched the edge of the doorway, and felt warmth, not heat, not fire, but the warmth of recognition, of memory, of welcome. He turned one last time, looking back down the path he had walked so many times before. He didn't see Margaret, but he imagined her there, in the distance, standing still, holding that old photograph, wondering where he had gone. Then he stepped through. The first sensation was light, not brightness, but lightness, as if gravity had lessened, as if the weight of years and sorrow had been peeled gently from his body. He walked through mist, thick and fragrant, full of strange blooms and soft sounds like bells underwater. The world here wasn't unfamiliar, but deeper, as if all the colors he'd ever seen were richer now, all the sounds layered with meaning. Shapes moved at the edges, people, places, echoes of other times. He thought he saw Claire, her hair longer now, her eyes clear. He thought he saw Matthew, smiling in a way Hank had never captured with his lens. And then others, hundreds of them, all standing in the distance, watching not like ghosts, but like people who had simply gone somewhere else. He didn't speak. He knew he couldn't, not yet. Words belonged to the world he had left. Here, it was feeling that mattered. Intention. He walked forward, deeper into this place, this beyond place, guided by instinct alone. And slowly, as he moved, he felt something inside him begin to loosen. The ache in his chest, the questions, the grief, the years of not knowing, all of it softened, thinned, and finally slipped away like leaves in a stream. He wasn't sure if time existed here, but he knew that something had waited for him. And he had come that far in the distance. The forest opened again, and a great white tree stood alone in a valley of mist. At its roots, a circle of stones. There, where others gathered, their familiar faces, ones he had only known through faded photographs and trembling stories. He walked toward them, and none of them were surprised to see him. They made room as he stepped inside. And as the last of the veil closed behind him, Hank understood not everything had to be explained. Some stories weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be entered, and his story, at last, had found its way home. The leaves had all begun to fall by the time Margaret realized that Hank wasn't coming back. Not in the ordinary sense, not in the way someone returns with stories and tired feet and the comfort of being known again. His absence wasn't sudden. It had been forming for years, like a slow tide pulling him farther out to sea, one quiet step at a time. But it wasn't until the first frost touched the window panes of their old house that she finally stood in his study and felt it, that stillness, that presence, like he had just left the room a moment ago and yet never would again. She didn't cry. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't try to retrace his steps, because deep down she understood something no one else in Fairwood truly could. Hank hadn't been lost. He had crossed. There was no body. No, just the old Nikon resting on the desk, lens cap off, battery full, and the screen lit up with a single image paused mid-flicker. A clearing in the woods, silver mist curling. At the edges, and at the center, barely visible, a figure walking through a doorway made of branches and light. She didn't need to zoom in. She knew it was him. And she knew he had found what he'd been searching for. In the following days, Margaret sorted through what he left behind. The notes, the maps, the photographs pinned across the walls like constellations. There were faces she didn't recognize, names written in his looping handwriting, circles around dates stretching back to the 1800s. All of it told a story, not just of disappearance, but of connection, of return. She didn't know what to do with it at first. For days she simply sat with it, touched the pages, let the ink sink into her fingertips like ashes. But something inside her stirred. She thought of Hank's voice, soft but sure, saying there was more to the world than we could see, that maybe we weren't meant to solve everything. Maybe we were meant to feel it, witness it, and carry the truth forward like a lantern through the dark. So she opened the shop again. She cleared the front display window and filled it with his photographs. Not just the mysterious ones, but the quiet ones too. A child with ice cream dripping down her chin. An old man tying his boots before fishing. A couple dancing alone in a backyard at dusk. She framed each one carefully and placed a small placard beneath the display. Photographs by Hank Albright. Moments that never truly leave us. People came, not in crowds, but steadily. Some from Fairwood, others from farther out. They came not only to see the images, but to speak, to tell their own stories. One man said he remembered his grandfather talking about a woman who vanished in the woods with her fiancé during the war. Another swore his sister had once disappeared for 3 days and returned with no memory but eyes that had changed color. A boy said he'd heard singing in the trees one morning and had followed it until the wind pulled him back. Margaret listened to them all. She recorded some of them in Hank's last journal, the pages now softened with use, his handwriting slowly, giving way to her own dot, and then, one evening near winter, she received a package. No return address. Just her name written in familiar script across the front. Inside was a single photo, printed on old-style film paper. The edges were curled. The image was slightly blurred, but unmistakable. It showed the clearing, the great white tree, and around it a circle of people. Among them, Hank, smiling, whole, looking not at the camera, but just beyond it, as if seeing something or someone coming into view. She held the photo to her chest and wept for the first time, not out of grief, but relief. He had made it. He had found them. Word of the photograph spread, and people began leaving things at the trailhead. Flowers, notes, rings, pieces of fabric from wedding dresses, long buried in cedar chests. It became a place of memory, not fear, and the town changed. Slowly, gently. The forest was no longer something to avoid, but something to honor. People began walking the old trails again, not to chase answers, but to feel close to those who had vanished. The mystery remained, but so did the love. Margaret never remarried. She didn't need to. Hank was with her in ways no one else could be. In the morning light that filtered through their bedroom window. In the soft creak of the front porch when the wind stirred just right. In the laughter of children outside. The shop, chasing one another beneath the trees he had loved so well. She ran the store until her hands grew too tired to frame the photographs herself. Then she passed it on to a young girl who had once asked too many questions and had grown into a woman who listened just as well. Years later, when Margaret was gone, they found her journal tucked beneath the counter, full of stories written in her careful script, alongside Hank's older pages. On the final one, dated only sometime near the end, she had written, "He went into the unknown, but what he found wasn't darkness. It was the rest of the story, the part we never let ourselves imagine. And now, because he went, we remember, we believe." and we are never truly alone again. And so the tale of Fairwood's vanished couples did not end in fear, but in reverence, in memory, in the understanding that some doors are not meant to be feared, but honored. And that sometimes, to truly see the world, you have to step beyond it. Not to escape, but to return bearing light. Asterisk and so. From a vanished couple on their wedding day to a photographer who followed a mystery into the unknown, we arrive at the end of this haunting journey. A journey not just through woods and whispers, but through memory, love, and the spaces in between. Some stories don't give us all the answers, but maybe the most powerful ones leave behind something even more valuable, a feeling that lingers, a question that echoes, and the reminder that what we remember never truly disappears. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply kept you company for a while, we're deeply grateful. Your presence here means the world. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like. It helps more people discover these stories. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel so you won't miss what's coming next. We have many more tales waiting to be told. Most importantly, we'd love to hear from you. Do you have a memory, a dream, or even a family story that this reminded you of? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is a part of this journey, too, and we're here, listening. Until next time, take care of yourself, stay curious, and never stop believing that some stories are meant to find us when we need them most.